Hey, good evening and welcome to Reel It In. This is our 11th episode of the first season, and tonight we are going to do a little bit of a season finale. I am Martin Hallberg, calling in from Stockholm, Sweden, and I'm here with my buddies.
Dan Sapin in Huntington, New York.
Joe Messina in Boston.
Cool. So, yeah, we have done 10 episodes during the last 10 or 12 months or so. And tonight we thought that we would spend this time, reflect together a little bit upon what we have done together in a broad sense. So, this kind of discussion is intended to encompass both thoughts about any underlying ideas or patterns or red threads that kind of run through the episodes, as well as more concrete reflections on how it has been to work together. We were all kind of newbies, podcasters, YouTubers starting this, or Joe has some experience, but both me and Dan were quite new into this. So how has it been to do this together? And also, a third kind of idea going into this talk could be what have we learned that could inform our views and thinking if we should do this again, if there is a season two of Reel It In to come through the pipes. So that's kind of a general introduction to the season finale. So I guess I don't know. What did you guys say? Where do we start? Um, I remember us kicking off the first episode was more if you can be you, maybe I can be me, and that was Michael Agan. We read a little quote by Mike Agan when he was meeting Beyond, and that was the first kind of entry into this. Uh, and I think that's been a big thing, like finding one's voice and an idiom and encouraging each other to be more fully who we can be, who we are. Uh, so I'd say that's one big piece for me at least, what we have been trying to do.
Yeah, I think Martin, Joe, uh, our first episode came after a long period in which Martin and I were meeting regularly by Zoom and just getting to know each other and getting to discuss some shared values, some ways we could kind of illuminate each other's thinking and feeling. And one of the things we had in common that really informed the decision to just press record and then to make some kind of a discussion show about this, a podcast, a YouTube show, was that we had something to share. And it was to carry forward a message we both took from the work of Michael Agan and Wilfred Bion, which, and there were many items in there, but I think the main one was about having the courage to find your own voice, speak your own voice, to listen carefully, become curious about what the other person, the mystery, the unfathomable qualities of another person's inner life, what it means that you had brought up, Martin, that Bion was reciting Milton
Mm,
at a gathering, and Eigen had written about wondering what's wrong with this guy, just
yeah.
getting up and starting to recite poetry. And then he recognized that this was somebody who had embraced his own thing, his own nature.
Mm,
And this was the way he wanted to introduce a talk. And that we were very taken with the idea that rather than trying to analyze or pathologize and diagnose the other guy and the weirdness of another person's idiom, which is another concept from Christopher Bolas, another great psychoanalyst. Um, what would happen if we just opened our ears and opened our hearts to the mystery of another person's voice, the unconscious speaking through that voice? And the first thing we came upon, and this I believe was um, a metaphor that Martin came up with, which was the idea of lighting a torch in the wilderness. A person who thinks he's alone lights a fire in order to bring heat, cook his food, bring some light to the environment. But not only does it enable him to see around him, it signals an unknown other, someone else on another hillside who perhaps similarly thought he was alone. And that by lighting that fire and others picking up on that signal, you give birth to a community that may find a whole new way of living and understanding themselves in the world. And we've moved through these topics over the course of all these episodes, all of them having to do with the courage to be in the moment, the courage to trust our own voice and to be open to the other, the courage to try to make something better out of a bad situation, to survive our own, the parts of ourselves we're least knowledgeable of and least comfortable with. And then to allow that self-acceptance to branch into the acceptance of other people. And then you get this intuition, I do at least, and we're hardly the first here, that if you open your ears and your heart, and lastly, your mind, because the mind is only going to make use of what is fed to it, then the idea of dominance, the idea of superiority, the idea of subjugation of another becomes unthinkable. The world becomes something that is created by people who trust themselves and trust their fellow people in order to create a new way of looking at the world, instead of trying to just shove it all into a box and keep it where it's comfortable. And I think this is carrying forward a positive message that I would like to see more of.
Yeah, well, that was one thing that I noticed from the Adam Schechter episode, especially, um, was when he talked about the show coming up in Mike Eigen's, what was it, Yahoo group, I think. Uh, it was that made me think, well, at the very least, we're getting through to the people closest to most of the subject matter. Uh, and that's something, if we're not quite hitting the wider audience yet, that's okay. But if the if the nerds get it, then the rest will come.
I think that's interesting. I think you touched on a good point there, Joe. Like, there was, that episode, the first one, and maybe a few other ones where we were staying more in, let's say, the psychoanalytically oriented realm and discussing more like how it could be to be a subject, an individual walking around in the world. But then we had a few episodes where we also tried to enlarge that in different ways. We talked about Afghanistan, for example, in one episode. We also talked about trauma and boxing in a very kind of broad sense, world affairs. And I think that has been an interesting element of this season. I can't say I think it's been like super successful, but it doesn't have to be. Like, I think it says something about what we're trying to do, even though we haven't really figured out how to do it. And I guess, what is that? There is some kind of mix. What we're trying to walk some kind of path, which is, there is a lot of better psychoanalysts, I would have to say, than me, at least. Since I'm not officially a psychoanalyst, I'm just interested in psychoanalytic theory. But I think there are nerdier people than both me and Dan, or at least if I speak for myself.
Speak for yourself.
Yeah. But we're a little bit maybe outspoken in that sense, that we are speaking what we think we know, whether if it's about Lacan or Melanie Klein or whoever, we do kind of put it out there and say, this is how I understood it. But then there's that other element that we try to somehow mix this with politics. And also you, Joe, have a big interest and passion about some of those topics related to climate change and in the environment, and also economics and politics, straight up politics. So I think that's an important feature of what we're trying to do. But I can't say I feel that we have nailed it. I think maybe from my perspective, we have been a little bit sharper on those more psychoanalytically tighter episodes, in my opinion. I think they have been more, like the Afghanistan one, for example, was very spread out, like we were all over the place. But it doesn't mean that what I'm trying to find is that kind of idiom of the three of us, like which is the idiom I believe is more than only a psychoanalytically oriented discussion about internal life. We want to do something more, but we haven't perhaps nailed that yet.
Yeah.
And there's a good, there are very good things, but there are also risks entailed in doing a show, something hopefully that is going to reach out to many ears, many people with many different kinds of receptivity. Coming from a psychoanalytic background, there is always the danger, and I think most of us who are at some point in some place in the psychoanalytic world will agree that very often psychoanalytic talk is utterly self-referential. You know, the ideas themselves are fascinating. They're also mysterious enough and malleable enough that you can turn them into almost anything. The problem there is bridging, and we talk about bridges in many respects, bridging the psychoanalytic way of looking at the the less well-known parts of ourselves, things having to do with the unconscious, the nature of the human being, the nature of oneself as a being, but then allowing that to carry us into the bigger world so that it informs anything we do, any relationship we might have. I mean, for goodness sake, the second episode, we went straight from the psychoanalytic insights of two of the great thinkers to boxing, and how a heavyweight champion boxer managed to come back from getting his ass kicked. Well, I think there's some potential there, simply that there are, if psychoanalysis does its work, which for Freud meant freeing the patient to love and to work, then anything we can love and anything that can qualify as work, the work we do in the world, can be informed by a deeper reflection. And the psychoanalytic paradigm allows us to think about ourselves in a more productive and honest and courageous way. But it also allows us to look at the intersubjective, the transpersonal, the common engagements we have in our life. Everything from going to the laundromat and talking to the lady behind the counter, to a good meal, to loving your loved ones. Just expand that infinitely. It is nourished by greater attention and respect for what you discover within, and how that tells you about the humanity of other people. It's not an academic endeavor. It's not just here to take away neurotic symptoms. It's a way of living more richly. And so we have a huge potential for touching a lot of different areas and for reaching the minds and hearts of other people, not because we're special, but simply because we're trying to embody the courage that we talked about in a few episodes, the courage to speak from an uncomfortable place, and the courage to listen, to embrace what another person has to bring us, even if the moment or the subject doesn't feel quite right.
I like that. I like that idea of like probing in and out somehow. Like sometimes things come up. We share stuff that are, you know, more or less personal or intimate or feel truer or more resounding in a way. And then other times we kind of slide out and we talk more maybe general term or technical terms, or there is something to that. It makes me think of that Winnicott, you know, like there is a joy to hide out, but it's an even greater joy to be found. You know, when kids are playing, like you like to hide away from your friends, but you're even more happy that they find you after a while, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a Winnicott quote that goes like that, that there's a great joy in hiding out, but an even greater joy in being found out again.
Yes.
But Joe, what do you take, like which episode, Joe, do you think like comes up as some one that you remember that was productive or gave you like something nourishing that lit you up or got that torch within you to kind of come alive?
Yeah, I think 2 and 3, the pivot and the real, definitely uh like I felt like I started to open up a little bit in those, particularly, and then in general we started to break in a little bit. We started to crack the shell a bit on like what we were trying to find. Uh so yeah, I think it's about being real, and that's what that's what we're trying to do with this episode. And uh we started to find a little bit of um fun in it, I think, especially when we got to the Adam Schechter episode. Um when we're talking a lot about Seinfeld and comedy, and he was just a funny guy, and it just became um started to become a show.
Yeah. There's something else it says, because we run a number of risks by coming at this from we keep using the words psychoanalytic, psychoanalysis, which is not exactly a word that brings to mind a day at the park, or just a good old party. It's stiff, it's dusty, it's private, it's one can be pretty dubious about it. But there is, I think, a message that could come through, and especially if we find a better way to deliver it, that the ritual, the treatment ritual of psychoanalysis is really not the point. If what a psychoanalytic session and a psychoanalytic vignette case study starts out as, it happens to be a closer look at what is happening inside a person and between people, then it's really just a starting point for being more honest, for being more open to one's own inner experience and to what another person can bring, a way um, of bringing the shadow part of ourselves into the light, of being more open to people we wouldn't ordinarily want to pay attention to for reasons we may not even know. And that if the psychoanalytic work works, and we manage to make this a more interesting dialogue as we go along, then all we're really doing is trying to encourage ourselves and anyone who wants to listen to be more open to experience, to whatever matters to them, to what is presented that comes as a surprise. It's really a way of talking more deeply, but also more playfully. Because think about it, the psychoanalytic ideal is to be more spontaneous, to speak what comes to one. And if it happens to catch a certain energy, a certain momentum, then it's funny that one of us is a comedian, one of us, two of us at least, love this sort of ritualized fighting, this way of channeling aggression. We've got creativity here in a number of forms. If what we're doing is allowing ourselves to make more and more connections between the sort of base aspects of our own lives, the aggression, we barely even we played around with some sexuality ideas. We've done a lot with popular culture. We're speaking today in the shadow of the Russian invasion of the Ukraine, one of the abominations of contemporary times. And so we see what's at stake when there is unchecked violence, when the desire to dominate and to fulfill a narcissistic dream goes unchecked, unreflected upon. What we're trying to do is open up our reflection so that no one has to act out this awful bullshit that keeps bringing the world to a darker place. Hence our use of the metaphor of lighting a torch. It's not to burn things down, it's to illuminate them and to bring people together.
Yes.
Mhm. Yes. What was I going to say? I had something bright
Who
I was going to say.
cares?
Exactly. I forgot it. But anyhow, we were about the brawl, the pivot. Yeah, now I remember. one thing that I really enjoyed with this, and I mean, I'm preoccupied by this in general, and I think I was especially so in the when we did the first 4 or 5 episodes. But I've also enjoyed this element of talking to you guys, is the working of analogy. Like you take a concept that is established somewhere and you put it somewhere else. Like, for example, this idea of the pivot, just that word of the pivot, in boxing it refers to, like, you put your foot, like you pivot, right? You guys are American, you know what a pivot is. So you pivot, but that term can be applied, in my view, in many different situations in life. Like, how do you pivot? When do you pivot? How do you know how to pivot out of, like, let's say, a job situation that we talked about with Joe in one episode? Like, is it possible to pivot from that place with that boss that was screaming at you? How do you pivot in a relational setting, with your family, your partner, your friends? um, so I think we have done or in my view at least, we have done some of those things in these talks, and I really enjoy that. And that's why I think also mixing boxing with psychology and psychoanalysis, music, stand-up comedy, improvisation, they're all different forms that allow us to kind of take topics and put them in, fuck around with them, basically. And that enlarges at least my way of thinking. It helps me. It, like, opens up the small avenues where I can be like, I haven't seen this thing before. And I think one such episode for me was the one we spoke about, the trust episode, where we spoke about music. Like, that was very, very cool. I think we spoke about how these musicians became kind of like objects of reference for us. Like, I remember Dan saying that he would go to speak to Ralph Towner or John Coltrane, or, like, I'll go and have a chat with him, basically. And I think that way of understanding something, it is very psychoanalytically usable. You can use that lingo, but it's also very relatable in any of the arts and in life in general. Anybody understands what it means when Dan says, I go and have a sit with Ralph Towner, and I'll start my day with him because it gives me something. So that way of using analogy, I think. And we also had one episode, was it with Adam, when we spoke about that stage? Remember? Like, when you come on a big stage and you have all the lights projected at you as a kind of comedian, what does that do to you? Like, how the hell do you cope with holding that space, everybody else sitting down, you're standing up, like all the projections that goes on in those fields. That's also an image that's applicable, I think, within a psychic realm and in many different contexts in real life. So that way of using analogy, I think it's something I really appreciate talking to you guys, because you're both quite eclectic in that sense. You can go in different domains, and I like that.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, and hopefully it's doing something for the people. Um, should we talk a little about um, uh, getting? Well, I guess I'll say that it has just been nice to podcast again. Um, I had been doing a show about politics, and I it kind of fell off just because I had a lot going on, and it's hard to be the only one doing all the work for the podcast. So now we at least split things a little bit. Um, and so yeah, it's cool to get back to this because I even when I was doing stand up, I always felt like something was missing if I didn't have a podcast or something like it going. And now with this and my YouTube channel, I feel like that itch is being scratched or addressed.
So what itch is that? What can you say about the itch itself? Because what we're doing here is, when Martin was talking about all the different things we touched on, the music, the boxing, the concept of trust, politics, comedy, jazz. Yeah, we planned only to the extent that we made mental notes of the things that we liked and some of the interesting parts of the conversations we had. But most of this stuff came out simply because it occurred to us, because these connections sort of presented themselves to us. Not everything is planned. And one of the ways you come upon ideas like this is by being willing to play with ideas, that ideas can be toys as well as these packages for deeper insights and love and the unity of the human spirit and all that stuff. It spans the silliest to the most profound. But what is it that you had wanted, Joe? You know, what you were talking about before.
I don't. I think there's something to having the sort of not just a recording, because you can obviously make a recording of stand up, but usually that's something that you work towards for a while, and then you record sort of a um finished thing that looks like a finished thing, um and no one realizes that you're not just getting up and saying that stuff out of nowhere. um this actually is that. This is actually just saying things. um and I have been interested in podcasts since very early, when they started to become something. I think I uh sort of missed the like golden age of talk radio and um uh shock jock, or you know, whatever, Howard Stern and that kind of thing. So I didn't know that like home existed already. But then like when I got to late high school, early college, podcasts started to become a thing. Like savvy comedians and stuff were realizing like, oh, this is probably something I should get on board with. You know, there was Mark Maron, like we've talked about, Dan, who I think you said you knew him from back when he was like a Greenwich Village comedian. Um, and I knew him from when he hit a wall and said, I don't know what I'm going to do with my life, because I'm, you know, 45 or whatever, and I have not reached the heights of success that my friends have. And he was one of the first to realize that podcasting was a thing, and his podcast was huge for a long time. um but yeah, so I was really into that early on, and I think it's taken me years to be able to articulate it. But I think that it's because it's just a conversation, and it's just um a process that you get to watch, rather than just here's the thing I put together. um the videos I make are obviously like, you know, I put them together and edit and do all this stuff. But I think you can see a little bit more with that like, oh, there was a process here, there was clips, and you put them in a certain order, and that, you know, uh that whole thing. So there's something about that, being able to um not have that curtain, sometimes literal, behind between you and a performance, or what, or like what a performance or a piece of art is. um I like that in modern day we have sort of, in many ways, done away with that. It's there's no there's no secret anymore. Like, this is a show. You don't get to see how the magic happens. It's just, you know, here's how we did it.
And how we
Cool,
did
yeah.
it was to just talk.
Yeah.
Which takes a certain amount of trust of self and other.
Right. um that's the sound of trust. Our most
Yeah,
recent episode
yeah.
of Google Tomorrow, March 7th.
Oh
So
yeah.
I was thinking,
But I like that. I think it's something, you know, it's what is it called? Banal, but also profound in a way. What you're
yeah,
saying, that there's a difference between serving a pre kind of thought out, like, here is the result, versus what we're doing is the opposite. It's just like, we don't know what we're doing. And we'll invite you to that
Right.
Yep.
process. Yeah.
And when someone asks you, Martin, why should I listen to you just figure out what you're going to say in the moment with a couple of guys who are also just not quite clear on what they're doing?
Yeah, you probably shouldn't, I guess. I don't know. But isn't
I all drive home safely. It's
Yeah,
been
exactly.
unusual.
Yeah. But isn't this also like part of this phenomena? I mean, you guys would know it better than me, especially you, Joe, maybe. But this, where people live cast, like we have been thinking about maybe for a potential season 2, to do this broadcast it live, right? When we speak
Yeah.
like this.
Yeah.
So you have those people that for hours they just live cast, and there
Yeah.
is something, is this like a version of, I remember in the 90s in Sweden was that reality TV thing came,
Yeah.
like I remember the first few shows where there's like teenagers, like later teens, 18, 19, 20, that would move into a house like Big Brother, and they would film them, and they
Yeah.
would do all kinds of stuff. They get drunk, or they'd have arguments and sleep with each other and so on. So you get to follow exactly real time what happened. I guess this is like the sequel to that.
I guess it
People
is.
just
Yeah.
talk, and
One
they,
big difference, though,
yeah,
the reality shows didn't have a lot of reality in them.
yeah, for sure.
That's true.
And it's funny that we have, this fight for charity thing I'm doing, this charity boxing match. We got a nice range of people. We have this young woman, really nice girl, who comes in from a weightlifting background, and she's a speech therapist, and she's taken the boxing part really seriously. And we were chatting, and I asked her, well, what are you doing when you're not here? And she tells me she's actually just finished filming the first season of a reality show. And she describes, oh yeah, it's a reality show like all of them. My role is the home wrecker. And well, this is just a closer look at this so-called reality that is being served up, because you're supposed to be setting up a bunch of people in a real situation, Real Housewives of get me out of here. And she was cast, a 23-year-old woman fresh out of school is cast in the role of a home wrecker in a reality show that has no reality in it. And we get a laugh about this. So what is this form of entertainment where you set people up in a totally canned situation? I'm thinking this is, in some respects, the analogous to professional wrestling. The difference is that professional wrestlers are highly skilled athletes, whereas the reality show people are not supposed to be anything more than people who make the viewers feel maybe a little more comfortable about themselves. But what we're doing,
but yeah, for
we're
sure.
totally unscripted.
Yeah, but I guess my point was just that TV format was format of people doing nonsense in a way. That was my thinking. That it was not like, welcome to Jeopardy show, we have 5 guests and they are blah blah blah. It was like people going about their business, and then, like you said, it was not real, so it was kind of fabricated, but it was still not orchestrated. Or how do you get what I mean?
Yeah,
Like,
because I
yeah.
think what happens with a lot of those, like my wife and I watch the Real Housewives shows, and that's despite my best intentions, she's gotten me hooked. Because
They do grab you, don't they?
yeah, well, it's a fascinating look at our society. I mean, because these are real people, like they do exist, and fortunately or not. But yeah, it's weird because for years they, on specifically these that Real Housewives shows, at least, they wouldn't show you the cameras. I think like they would not mention that it's a show. Like there were certain, again, like walls of separation like that, where it was like, we're doing the like show business thing where you're not gonna actually see what's going on here. You're just supposed to watch this and pretend that just like you watched freaking Bing Crosby in a movie. Like you're watching Teresa Giudice from New Jersey have this argument with her husband, and
Pay no attention to the moron behind the curtain.
right.
Yeah.
And it's interesting now because sometimes they will show the cameras, and or they'll be like, oh man, are they going to use this footage? Or like they'll actually allow them to say and do some of these things that reveal you're watching a show. And yes, some of this is orchestrated in that, they'll go on these trips, and it's funny because it's like, well, what we're doing is putting them all in a house together. It's not just like they're meeting up somewhere. They're all going to have to be together for this weekend or whatever. And all these fights happen and whatever it is. And I think what happens is that's manufactured because would they all be on this trip together? Otherwise, probably not. And then what else, the other thing that's manufactured is sometimes producers will have to goad things. They'll be like, hey, how do you feel about the fact that this one said this, or whatever, like, or maybe you should tell Ramona that Lisa said this about her, and see what happens. And then the reaction is real, and then the target will actually get upset and say something, and then the person they said it to actually gets offended by that, and then they go back and forth. That part of it, I think, is at least partly genuine, so it's interesting that they are so there's two reasons I say that. Yeah, I think like that's what people are looking for is like that real part of it. And then two, it's also just interesting that they're moving even further away from the construct of TV that it is, and just being like, yeah, we're here too. The producers and camera people are here too, and we're going to be real with you too by telling you that.
Let me ask you a question though. Speaking as the psychoanalytic therapist here, I cannot help but think of a particularly interesting question, which is, what do you suppose it means that we shifted into talk about this strange hybrid of produced and spontaneous?
Well, speaking as the psychoanalytic therapist in training over here, I was having the exact same thought, actually, when we were talking about this. That is this a coincidence? Like, why the hell are we talking about Ramona bitching at Lisa in Big Brother? And no, I don't think it is a coincidence. I mean, look at the show's name, Reel It In. We had that episode about trauma and the brawl and hyper reality, and how it shifts of like being aware. We've talked a lot about consciousness and altered states of consciousness. We've talked a bit about drugs and grief and pain, how we can experience the world in different ways. So I think this discussion is a reflection of that. Like, what is actually real, what is staged, what is not staged, how does one perceive genuinity versus fabricated stuff. I think that is very much at the center of what we are. Like, look at what we're talking about. Like, where's my voice, where's your voice, what's the idiom? Can you hear me? Do we connect with each other? Do we trust each other? How does trust sound? Like, there's definitely a kind of theme of like, is it possible for people to really connect? And if so, how do we think about that? How do we talk about that?
Yeah.
How do we approach that? So
Right.
I think what we're talking about now is very much in line with that. What are those shows contra what we're doing? What we're doing contra real podcasts and so on?
Right.
That would be
So-
my
I think it was
Uh-huh.
also a tangent
What do you think?
from we were talking about live streaming, and I think there's something that we have sort of uncovered here is like everything is performative to a degree, but I do think that doing a live stream version of this show could get us even closer to that real maybe that ineffable, unreachable real that we're reaching for, it gets us a little bit closer to it, even if we can never quite get to it by just connecting our brains to everyone else's or whatever.
F the ineffable. I noticed, Joe, that over your right shoulder is the vinyl of Pink Floyd, The Wall.
Yeah.
And I didn't realize at first, talk about, the workings of this isn't quite the deep unconscious, but I kept having the line, no dark sarcasm in the classroom, running through my head before I consciously acknowledged the obvious source over there. And at the same time, I was thinking, well, why was I so sarcastic and contemptuous of reality shows? What was it? Almost as if I felt like, no, I don't want to be associated with that pseudo real, with that way of dropping little stink bombs in this house of real people to see how people react. And I want to put that out there because as I was listening to this, I was really in touch with something I haven't felt in a while, which was a sense of contempt. And I'm admitting that it's not something I planned to feel or planned to talk about, but that's kind of the idea, that we're sort of walking on what you mentioned Winnicott before, Martin, walking on a knife edge. Winnicott talked about how the artist is always on a knife edge, and Winnicott was talking about the on one side of this knife edge or tightrope, is insanity. What happens if the emotions and the drives within you take over? Well, you lose it. And on the other side is beauty, creation, something that can be discovered. But here we're doing something that is kind of improvisational. We're trying to talk from the heart. We're trying to talk in as much of a spontaneous way as we possibly can, and yet also make it relatable to a hypothetical audience. Hopefully becomes a real audience, people who enjoy or take something edifying out of what we're doing. And I find myself reaching, at least inwardly, for, well, how am I going to make this interesting for people who are not yet watching this show? Because we run the risk of just indulging ourselves by talking about things that are interesting to us and telling ourselves, well, the red thread that runs through it is we want to pay it forward. We want to wake up a kind of more honest, real way of relating and being open to other people. But at the same time, there is this desire to do sort of, hey kids, let's put on a show. So what is it that we do, since what we're talking about is a finale of the season, sort of a meta episode where we look back at our episodes? And what I want to put out there is the question, how do we take this paradigm for this show, reel it in, which used to be called making it up as we go along, and making it something that people will look forward to for the next batch, maybe, I don't know, even possibly tell their friends.
Right. Yeah. Well, I think that, again, making them part of it by by live streaming is an interesting way that it's an interesting option that's available now. And I think that we will probably be surprised by how much they can add to this conversation, even if it's 10 people watching. I think that could be very cool. Should we could get into some of the sort of technical things that I think we could work on as well.
Go for it. Yeah.
So one thing I found re-listening to the episodes was the ones with the separate tracks sound way better. Because probably because I can fiddle with them individually in Logic. So I think just making sure that we do that before we start. but also checking the sound. Like, Dan, you tend to come in kind of loud.
So I've been
I think
told.
it's your, I think it's whatever setup you have. I'm not just you.
No, it's my theatrical training.
And I don't know what kind of mic you're working with, Dan, but
It's called
could
Mac.
okay, Mac mic. So yeah, I think I don't know how good the mic I have is, or how well I have set it up, so we could probably all improve. But
Sounds good.
if you guys both used like a mic that could help us too, because that it just improves, I think, everything. So
Mhm.
those are big things, I think.
No, I do plan on buying a better webcam and microphone, hopefully in the next week or two. So that's good. You are clearly the most acoustically appealing part of this show at the moment.
But I think maybe one thing that would spark more. I mean, you mentioned, Joe, that the Adam episode was fun. I agree, it was fun because we had like a little bit of a banter about various things. Like there was the Seinfeld and the Spectators, and there was Capitol Hill. Like there was all kinds of stuff in that episode. But there was a little bit of a banter going on, and I don't know what you guys think about like themes for a second season, but I think from my end, it would be nice to see if we could find something that centers more maybe on like vitality and joy and enlivenment, like what do you call it, enlivened, like to be enlivened, to be full of life, whatever that means. Even though we have talked about those things a lot during this episode too, I found that we have done that from a very much of a, at least I have, very much from a depth psychological perspective, like very much from the fucking the cellars of existence, like the
Well, that raises an interesting archetypal point, Martin. Let's in 1927, Jung. I'm sorry.
No, but I don't know. Like I don't know how you feel, but at least for me, maybe I have been in that place a lot during last year, and like you mentioned the word surviving, Dan. Like I don't know. I for me, it's exactly what I wanted to do, and I think it's been enriching and beautiful and very kind of expanding. Like I've gained a lot in terms of my thinking from all these episodes. But for me, I feel a little bit the urge to jump into more kind of fun and games, whatever that would mean, like more of a banter, more jokes, more less kind of heavy stuff.
Yeah,
It's interesting you say that. I was starting to count the number of times somebody used the word trauma during our first several episodes. I think I used some version of the word humiliate half a dozen times in 3 episodes. And I'm thinking, well, it's all in context. That's fine, but that ain't entertainment. And
Maybe
yet
not.
want to keep it real. But let's face it, a show provides a context. We want a context that enables a look at joy, at play, at
yeah,
the various forms of cool shit we can do and think about.
yeah. Do you remember there was a short-lived show called Trauma that was about, like, it was some like medical drama.
It was doomed from the outset, wasn't it?
Yes.
Failure,
yeah.
abjection.
When it was on, there was the comedian Eddie Pepitone, who is a loud Italian from New York. We know a few of those. And he was on actually Mark Maron's podcast and a live recording, and he said, "Why are we relaxing to a show called Trauma?" So that's what I thought of.
We did that for them. Yeah.
Right. I mean, we talk a lot about how we're into all these entertainment factors like music and boxing and Star Trek and whatever, and we could bring that in more in a
Mhm.
way that is just a good old time.
I like that. Let's see if we can take a note. But then again, like I just have to I mean, if it's done badly, like a well done trauma show is a lot better
Yes.
than a badly done comedy show, or like an enlivened show where people are not enlivened,
Yeah.
or
I'm
you
gonna
know a bantering show where people don't trust each other to banter.
Yeah.
Like you see, like there is there, and I think this kind of reel it in.
I'm gonna write that down. Make the show good.
Yeah, exactly.
That's a little
No, but
radical.
No,
no, but I
I
think
see what you're saying. Yeah.
yeah, there's a reason, I guess, why we have centered around all those topics. Because if the kind of if the overarching theme is about trying to have a real discourse and speaking from within ourselves and stuff, then I guess that's the number one priority, and whatever comes from that from there will be what we follow in a way. But if it can be done, to the extent that there is a little bit more speed under the shoes, that'd be
Well,
better.
look at what we've done. Martin, you pointed out, I think absolutely correctly, you came at this from very much of a psychodynamic perspective. You're a student of this now. I'm still a student of it. I've been a practitioner of it for a long time. There are a number of people who tell me I'm funny, although I'm not sure how often I get to be funny. And it occurred to me that when you have a what is it, a practice, a cultural context, whatever you want to call psychoanalysis, uh, which has at its core, between Freud and Klein, Freud saying that the goal of analysis, other than freeing the patient to love and to work, is to transform neurotic suffering into ordinary misery. That's a bit of a low bar. If the best you can aim for is ordinary misery, and Melanie Klein says that the goal is to reach the depressive position, to go from paranoid schizoid, paranoia and isolation and avoidance of people, to a position where you just sort of accept the blah grayness of life. I'm sorry, we got to find something that goes a little further. And yes, it is 100 years after Freud wrote that, almost that long since Klein wrote it. But there is something about moving beyond our starting points. We start with the psycho. Yeah.
But look, I think now for me, one of these kind of underlying currents seems to become, and that is Mr. Winnicott. Like we have spoken a lot about Bion, we have spoken about Eigen, we've spoken about Klein, some about Lacan, and now today we have referenced the knife's edge, the hiding and being found again. And if there's one analyst to me that speaks about play, it's Winnicott.
And
Playing,
reality.
yeah,
Playing and reality.
playing in reality. But my point is that well, here this thing about being more joyous and joking around and being more lighthearted. I think play is a very good term because play can also be profound and serious and analyzed in, let's say, more deeper ways. What does it mean to play, who cannot play, and so on. But we can also play together in the straight sense of the word, just like let's fucking have some fun and play around. So I think play is a good term. So for me, it's interesting that we haven't spoke much about Winnicott, and today it feels to me that what comes out of this is Mr. Winnicott. Like maybe he's a guy we should look into a little bit more. Yeah.
I agree thoroughly. Well, first, along those lines, let me say that since we should probably also start recruiting some commentators for our upcoming live stream, let me invite any of you to send in ideas of things that might be fun to talk about, as well as things you might want to send us as comments in a sidebar. But no, I think the idea of bringing in, look, we are we have a heavy psychodynamic load here, and
Mm,
Uncle Donnie is the lovable analyst. He's the fun analyst. He's the one who
yeah.
talked about the beauty of spontaneity and play, and he doesn't exactly take his eye off the ball of the rough stuff. It's just he was very good at turning it into something worth aiming for.
Yeah, he's
You know,
exactly. It's a good. I like your description, introduction of him.
cool.
All right. So what do we have here? Like I've tried to take a few notes. I haven't been able to get that many, but we spoke a little bit in terms of the patterns. We spoke about the idiom and the lighting of the torch and being more of ourselves, speaking our voice. And you, Dan, spoke a little bit about this kind of honesty as a way to also subjugate the narcissistic tendency to dominance, and like this opening up of discourse as a kind of good action in itself. That's an Aristotelian kind of, like, the good conversation is valuable and worthy in its own right. It produces ends just by virtue of being a good conversation. um, we also spoke about like this thing that ideas can be toys, or I made that about the analogy that we can move around things. So those were some of the kind of red threads that I noted that we identified. We went on to talk about, Joe, you told us about you enjoyed podcasting again. It brought us into an interesting talk about like this being just conversation as opposed to being something more staged or preordained, like prefabricated. We started talking about the reality TV shows for a while. Uh, and you mentioned a few of the technical things. The sound was good when we had the separate tracks, and maybe we should all get some good cameras. And then we kind of end off here on some thoughts about mixing play and fun with these more kind of psychodynamic, conceptual prismas or whatever that we use next to the boxing and the comedy. And like Joe said, also to maybe bring that in more, maybe bring in the boxing and the music and the comedy in a bit more, and see what
This is
happens if
our
we start.
stuff. These
Yeah.
are our toys.
And if we start
Like,
live streaming.
yeah. You think about it. One of the differences between a network show of some kind and what we're doing is that nobody else is deciding whether we get a second season other than us.
Mm.
We get to, if we have a viewership of 10, or the 10 million I'm aiming for, God help us, it's still on us to make it something, and not to have to make any compromises we don't feel like making.
Mm.
So you want it, let's do it. That being said, I'm just curious, our final two episodes, which were, I think, pretty rich, our webisode, our Dr. Webb Garrison double episode, and the spiral. The metaphor of the spiral there, I think, was one of our more interesting ones. I don't want to leave that unmentioned, partly because Webb brought a lot to it, but also because I think we hit some stuff there that may be harder to articulate. What do you think? The spiral and the clinical versus the indigenous healing, the spiritual, the scientific. Where does that fit into what we do?
Well, I think of spirals as like again, like that. I think I think I mentioned in the web episodes that I saw this spiral thing happen a few times when I did mushrooms, and I think it was I think it was partially telling me there you're not going anywhere by taking mushrooms. It was telling me like stop
No.
looking for something because it's just you're going in circles. And but like the more sort of um uh positive takeaway from that is that uh you keep zeroing in on this point, and I think that we man, I swear this was going somewhere.
Oh, it is.
You sound high, man. You're like, I had that idea.
I know. um I, I think that healing and recovery and improving oneself are things that we keep coming back to. And I think that's sort of what I was thinking, that it's like, we go around and we have like this whole roundabout way of getting to it. That's the show. That's like that's the reason you listen to a show instead of just like going to the doctor, I guess. I don't know. We can go to the doctor too, but that there's something in there about we are on this spiraling healing journey. um yeah, right, does
Yeah,
that make any sense?
I think so. I think it was good. And like
Well,
you
my
said,
mushrooms are starting to wear off, but I think I'm still with you, Martin. What were you saying?
no, but like you said before we started today, Dan, about like it can reach a higher point, like somehow an aggregated shift upwards of like having that spiraling conversation where you do the ins and outs instead of going straight to the doctors, can somehow enable a kind of aggregate shift of vision or understanding or navigatory skills in a way. And I think the spiral is also important. I mean, it's important in many respects to me, but one of the things I like with that is that virtuous cycle versus destructive cycle becomes very apparent in that image. Like, if you do good things and the world is, you are in the depressive position rather than the paranoid schizoid, and language sticks together and people listen to what you're saying and you trust each other, you know every good decision builds a new good decision, and the world gets bigger and richer and you grow. But you could also fall in the opposite logic where you withdraw and where you mistrust and where everything decreases in value or in love or whatever is the kind of way
Yeah.
we talk about things. And I think the spiral is a very good metaphor for that things can go upwards, but they could also turn. And in a way, I think life is a little bit like that. I don't think that anybody continuously only expands and expands. I mean, eventually they will implode if they do, you
I think
know?
what you might be getting at here too, Martin, is that the spiral is an inherent kind of, first of all, it is a truly an archetypal pattern in the human, as much as it is one of the creator's favorite shapes, because we keep finding that spiral on every scale in nature as much as in the mind. And it's funny, what came to mind was that on the one hand, you have this sort of aggregate this aggregate growth where you circle around a familiar point, but from a different elevation each time, a slowly accreting, slowly aggregating thing akin to individuation, where, if you rush right at a thing, it's not all that different from plummeting straight down. And
Yeah.
that the spiral is a way of, if such psychoanalytic phrases as regression in the service of the ego, namely going into art or into meditation or sort of away from the intellectual and into the deeply experiential, is something that is good and nourishing for the psyche as a whole, then what you are doing is sort of spiraling towards and away from ordinary ego consciousness, and that you grow on the broader scale by sort of growing around and around the inner core, that axis of yourself. And that when you must go down, even when you hit a really low depressive patch in life, the difference between losing it, decompensating, and regressing because, well, it's time to struggle a bit. There is something that needs to be reconciled. The healthy ego is going to spiral around that axis. It is not simply going to plummet. Um, and so the spiral shape is something that is neato. Yes, you do get, I got all kinds of cool fractals and spirals too, but I also had a guided tour on my mushrooms. There was a voiceover that was very interesting. I keep trying to capture it. But I have to stop doing it in public spaces though, but that's another issue. The We don't have a laugh track, do we? Quickly, can you add one in? So the shape is cool, but it communicates a lot. You like Martin, you used the phrase, the unsaturated symbol,
Mhm.
something that Beyond speaks about. The spiral is an unsaturated symbol. It is both a shape, but it is kind of a vector, a way of moving through life without crashing headfirst into things.
Nice one.
Yeah.
I like that. Like a buffeting experience somehow. Like a buffeting way of being in the world that enables you to not crash and burn. I wish I would have known this when I was 15, man. Where was my spiral back then?
Yeah. Well, our show didn't.
Where's the laugh track? Yeah. All right.
Where's time travel when you really need it?
Yeah. All right. So since the catastrophe has already happened, speaking in Winnicottian terms,
Been survived.
Yeah, it's been survived, and we have spiraled out of the vortex and decided we're going to go into a second episode or second season where we will play around. Um, then maybe now it's time to start wrapping up this meta episode today. We're in closing season 1. I don't know. What do you guys think? Are we missing any kind of needed viewpoints, or perspectives? Have we covered what we wanted to cover in this season finale?
I think we have.
I got nothing to add, except I want to invite our viewership to put your comments up and make your suggestions if you wish.
Yeah, I'll add. Anchor gives an option to add a question that people can answer on the thing. So we'll do that.
So if you've been on board and listened to us reel it in, you can help us reel it in and give us some ideas for a second season. And please come join us. You'll see us back because we're going to deluge your social media with mentions that we're back so you can celebrate. And I can't wait to be seen. Actually, I hope to see some of you there, at least the words and the margins.
Cool. And I think we have, like, for whatever it's worth, we have some what is it, maybe 250 podcast listens and maybe 400 or 500 YouTube views or something on the season 1. Is it? Maybe I'm hipstimating too much here, but it's in those kind of brackets. I think when you go into the Anchor, we can see that you can see how many.
Yeah, we got a lot on the first one. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So there's 177, at least in mine. I don't know if it's different because we have in different countries or something.
Yeah.
So thanks to all of those who are the selected few of that group. Really appreciate that people have taken the time to listen to this. We hope you'll continue to and send in your feedback and viewpoints and whatnot. And we'll go back into the lab and to the cave, into the studio, and hammer together what will, I guess, in a few weeks' time, then hopefully, we are now in early March 2022. So mid-March or April 2022, we should be good to go with the season 2.
Reel it in 2.0.
Yeah, we did it. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye, folks.
All right. Yeah.